Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our session today on engaging with nature finance to address the biodiversity crisis. We've got a great lineup of speakers and it's a mix of disciplines, so I think that's reflective of how we should be thinking about understanding this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our first plenary speaker, who is Helen Avery, and she's head of the nature programmes at the Green Finance Institute, and her team is focused on mobilising private sector investment into nature conservation and restoration and nature-based solutions and nature positive outcomes, working with governments, financial institutions and corporates. So thank you.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've got all my timers and stuff set up because I can ramble on a bit. Is this mic all right? I feel like I can hear myself echoing. I thought we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about how we are looking at how we mobilise private sector investment into exactly what Helen just said, nature restoration, nature-based solutions and nature-positive outcomes. And it might not be quite what you're expecting, I'll explain that in a moment. But just to reiterate what we kind of are looking at when we think about the finance gap for nature. So we need close to $4 trillion to reach our global biodiversity targets. About 2.6 trillion to restore over 1 billion hectares of degraded land and build resilience to drought. We need 6.2 trillion to hit our climate targets. We know a lot of that will have to be delivered by nature-based solutions. And we've got 97 billion for nature targets in the UK. And this is all by 2030. So it's quite enormous amount of money that we have to move. And we're not expecting it all to come from the private sector, but I think we're expecting a lot to come from the private sector. And it should, because as we all know, we've not really priced in externalities, and business benefits from all the wonderful thing that nature provides and doesn't pay for it, really. And so we need to sort of get private sector moving. These numbers are so big, and I feel they can be quite daunting. I can't even imagine what £1 million looks like, let alone 4 trillion. But I was actually just Googling around and Apple's market cap is 3.7 trillion. That made me feel better. I'm not sure why. It just made me feel like, oh, well, if just one company's market cap is close to 4 trillion, then I'm sure we can get there. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was the logic I applied last night when I was going through trying to figure out what these numbers actually mean. So typically when we look at these kind of figures, we look at the finance gap, we then tend to think, okay, so what we need to do is get the finance sector in the room and understand from them what's holding them back from investing. And then what happens typically is we get them in the room and they'll say, well, we're looking for like 12% returns or whatever it is that they're looking for. And we can't get that. We're not being offered that at the moment. We have a fiduciary duty. So let's talk about blended finance. And then for another decade, we have conversations about blended finance and how we're going to get that working. And we don't get it working. And one of the things that, one of the biggest challenges is that it's actually, if you want finance to get moving, it's actually not finance that you should be starting with. It's actually some of the supply and demand is actually the private sector, it's businesses. So, well, I'm often, people think I'm going to come and talk about financial institutions and how we get them moving. I actually don't talk about that so much anymore and talk much more about how we get businesses to move, because that's what creates a mechanism for finance to flow. And that really is kind of the focus of all the work that I do now, is looking at how are we going to get businesses to move. And I thought that's what I talk about this afternoon, some of the challenges we see around businesses moving and maybe brainstorm a few ideas around what we think needs to be done. It's also an easier argument, I think, when you start talking about nature finance through the lens of let's get business moving, because I think we all understand that businesses should be paying for nature, whereas if you start to talk about financial institutions, people get quite scared. They think about, well, you're going to commoditize nature and it's going to be some whizzy unit or credit that's created and that's going to destroy the world. And we're saying, no, actually, what we need to do is get businesses paying for what they need to pay for. So there are several routes that we need businesses to take. There are several mechanisms, shall I say, that allow money to move from business into land managers' conservation projects. So nature markets is often the one that we talk about most, and these are voluntary carbon markets, biodiversity net gains. We have compliance markets, obviously, and we can talk about some of the challenges with those. But it is company A purchases credits or units from land managers or conservation projects. In any case, in any nature market, that is what's happening. It's between a company and it's between a land manager, a conservation project, or a project developer or farmer. Payments for ecosystem services, again, is about company A paying for ecosystem services delivered by land managers and conservation projects. So this might be water companies paying farmers to reduce their nutrients, for example, and paying for water quality improvements. And these all start to blur in a little bit, like what's a nature market, what's PES, what's nature-based solution, what's a supply chain. But again, we've got nature-based solutions. Company A will invest or pay for nature-based solutions to be delivered on the land. And this might be natural flood management, for example. It could be urban trees for cooling. There's a lot of companies that we talk to at the moment who are really, really nervous about how their workforce is going to get to work with the level of flood that we're going to be seeing in the next few years or the next decades. And also energy companies we talk to are really worried about heat and what that's going to do, and also water shortages, things like that. So it's kind of a climate adaptation interest that companies have here. And then supply chain transition, which again could be sort of merged into nature-based solutions or payments for ecosystem services. But essentially that's businesses who have some sort of physical risk in their supply chain. Again, it could be climate related, but it could be soil health decline that might be affecting the resilience for crops that they're buying. It could be transition risk, so some regulation coming down the road that's going to affect their businesses. So I know that obviously deforestation policies are coming out and how that affects businesses that are reliant on soy that's been developed in deforested areas. And then also litigation risk, which we are also seeing more of a reputational risk with your own consumers. So they're thinking about, okay, how do I start to shore up my supply chain against those risks? And what they will do is invest or pay for farmers' businesses to make changes. So I mention this because in every time we talk about the finance gap, we talk about this side, the finance and the finance sector provision of upfront capital and loans and investment. And all that is needed, but it will go nowhere if we don't have this very simple demand and supply. And at the moment, what we're seeing is the supply side is not our problem, actually. There's quite a lot of pipeline out there. There's willingness from land managers all over the world and conservation projects and NGOs and project developers to set up projects and deliver on any one of these things that needs to be delivered. It's just that there are no demand drivers. And that's one of the challenges we have at the moment, and I wanted to talk about a bit today. So just a reality check on business engagement. Just going to check the time and make sure I'm doing it right. And that is that we actually don't have a lot of business engagement on this issue. And that's quite a bold statement to make because there are many amazing groups that are bringing businesses together, but actually what are they doing on the ground? Lots of large commitments, but what we're not seeing is much activity moving forward. So if we look at nature-based carbon, for example, actually the demand for voluntary carbon decreased last year. I think we might see a bump this year. I don't really know. There's this chart on the other side that I think I got this from the MSCI that shows that, oh, look, amazing, offtake is actually increasing the amount of publicly reported nature-based carbon purchases, but it's gone from 5 to 10. This is not a huge amount that's happening in the voluntary carbon space. And yet the demand is really, really huge. I mean, only 7% of companies are on track to achieve their net zero targets for scope 1 and 2 emissions. They're obviously going to need to start paying for offsets, but they're not moving yet. And some of the reason is they're not being told to. So even in the UK, we have net zero pathways, for example, for sectors and for businesses, and businesses will set their own net zero targets. But there is no accountability, really. We're not checking to see how close are they to reaching those targets. Have they started
going through the mitigation hierarchy and looking to nature-based solutions, we're actually at a bit of a loss of what's actually happening. In fact, my question is often like, we don't even know what the current demand is for nature-based carbon. What are UK PLC's budget requirements for nature-based carbon? We don't know. What amount of that carbon will be purchased within the UK, when, and at what price point? None of this we know. And some of the feedback I get is, yeah, but it's such a moving feast that even if you were to do this piece of research now, it may well have moved in 6 months. But I think it's really good that we would have this research done. So my plea to anyone here who's interested in that is, please, we would love to see some of this research. On MBS, only 17% of nature-based solutions are paid for by the private sector. That's a global stat, and you'll have to email me if you want it, because I've forgotten where I got it, but I know the page I got it from last night. So the question is, how do we move businesses into climate adaptation? How can we evidence the efficacy of nature-based solutions better? Because one of the pushback we get from businesses is, well, we might invest in natural flood management, but is it going to work? Or we might invest in urban trees, but is it really going to have a cooling effect? So we need to sort of prove all of this out still. And how do we get them to care about climate adaptation? One of the things that we are starting to do just at GFI, but also I know that other organisations are also looking at this, like WWF, is bringing together companies and saying, well, like, what is your nature and climate risk together? Nature degradation obviously compounds your climate risk. So what is your climate adaptation costs that you are going to have to bring into your business, or what is the cost to your business if you don't have climate adaptation? And can we take that cost and actually invest it in the region that you're in, that you need those nature-based solutions to be in? And none of this has been done before. So at the moment, companies are just turning to governments to pay for nature-based solutions. So it's a challenge for us. And then supply chain models. So we track models that bring private sector investment into nature restoration all over the world. It's a fairly new project for us, so we don't have a huge data sample to pull from. But about 50% of the models we track, where the private sector is paying for land management change within supply chain models, comes out of a CSR budget. It isn't on the balance sheet, and that's one of the biggest issues we have, because we don't have demand drivers, because we don't have governments saying this is what we expect from business. They don't have targets they're being held accountable to when it comes to nature, or even the reduction in carbon emissions and offsets. What we're finding is that they're not taking it seriously, really. So it becomes a conversation where we talk to CSOs, so Chief Sustainability Officers, who get it. But then when you actually dive deeper into, the echo chamber that you're in, they say, I just can't get my CFO on board because it's not a balance sheet issue for us. So yes, we'll lob some money in through our CSR budgets, through our marketing budgets, but that is not guaranteed. That it tends to be like 1, 2, 3 years, and if your CEO changes or your financing situation changes as a company, then what are you going to pull first? Your marketing budget. So we actually need businesses to start recognising that this is a balance sheet issue and making investments from the balance sheet. So how can we demonstrate more there is supply chain risk? So the challenge we also have, actually let me just stop here. So this is just an example of what a business resilience model would look like. I know there's a lot on this page, but there is a landscape enterprise network. It's called LENS. You may have heard of this model. It started in England. There's LENS models in Hungary and Poland and Italy, and they are expanding. Small number of transactions, if you look, only 15 million euros to date. But this is a balance sheet investment. So you'll have Nestle, Diageo, maybe PepsiCo, and there are others that 3Kill work with, who understand that they actually need to change some of their farming practices through their supply chain in order to appease consumers, but also to shore up the resilience of that landscape. And so they are paying for farmers to make some changes and to transition to nature-positive farming or to reduce their nutrient runoff. But that's a balance sheet investment from them, because they see that as a risk. One of the challenges that they're worried about is the cost of capital coming down the line for them, and the cost of insurance in particular, around their supply chain resilience. So it's a great example, but they're quite rare. I mean, often we've got so many models, and it really is just companies just pumping in $1 million here and $1 million there on nature-based solutions for water, for example, because they're a beverage company, but it's got nothing to do with their actual supply chain. They don't see it as a balance sheet type or business case type investment. So we looked at what is the business engagement in the NBSAPs, in the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans that were submitted or supposed to be submitted at COP16. And actually, there was very little engagement by governments when they were developing those action plans. And they're supposed to be action plans. So the only way we can actually deliver on these targets is if we get businesses to deliver them. But with some exceptions. So France had a commitment to develop tools for sector-specific impact assessment. I'll jump through these, but Colombia set up a business advisory group that should say of 11 leading companies to help sort of work with the Ministry of Environment during the update process. And even if we look at our own NBSAP in the UK and the Environmental Improvement Plan that we have in the UK, there hasn't been much engagement with business. And in fact, what's going through now in the review period for the Environmental Improvement Plan is that they're trying to get more business engagement. And we're working on some of that I can talk about in a moment. But actually, this whole idea that you've got to engage businesses and make them invest is quite alien to governments at the moment. And I don't know from our conversations we've had with them if that's because they don't want to be seen as pushing businesses because of impacts on trade, for example, or just the political environment, or if, like many of us, they've jumped ahead and looked at financial institutions as the solution and blended finance instead of actually looking at what the piping really needs to be, and that's around the business environment. So one way we've been thinking, well, it's actually a WWF idea, I should say, but we love it at GFI and have partnered with them in the UK to try and push this forward, is something called Nature Positive Pathways, which I'm expecting that name may change because the term nature positive hasn't been bottomed out, and I'm not sure it ever will be bottomed out, which is fine. I'm not sure we need it to be bottomed out. But essentially, we need to sort of figure out, of our national targets, and some of those that go into the global biodiversity targets, so combining our domestic targets with our global targets that we've committed to, what are we expecting each sector to contribute? And in the UK, we've done this already with net zero pathways, but we've not done it around the broader natural environment targets that we have. So we're talking to DEFRA at the moment about, as they review the Environmental Improvement Plan, can we deliver sectoral contribution pathways and then non-specific, non-prescriptive actions that those sectors and businesses can start to take. And that way we can start pulling all these massive global targets and domestic targets we have actually down into the ground and then out into land restoration or marine restoration, which we never really talk about. So we're really hopeful that we'll start to move this way next year. And while the UK may be the first to adopt it, we know that there are other countries talking to WWF about replicating this model. Just as a sort of side note, I think it throws into question the idea of like a global biodiversity credit, because what each country needs to do is take their own domestic targets and then figure out what each of those sectors needs to deliver on domestically. And that's sort of the route we're thinking of, we're sort of moving towards in the UK. And we can talk about more of that in Q&A. Let me just see how I'm doing. It took about 3 minutes. So increasing the role of business. I know this is a lot of words on a slide, but essentially here are some of the solutions that we're looking at. And I am unfamiliar with what ecologists do, and I'm ashamed to say I'm unfamiliar with the wonderful work of academic institutions and researchers. So I'm really keen to understand where can we fit you in, like what are all the skills and expertise that you can plug in to help us with some of these to be delivered. So for nature markets, I would say we need much more accountability around net zero targets that can drive nature-based carbon demand. I mean, obviously it needs to be high integrity, and there are questions about that at the moment, but at the moment we don't even have the demand in place, so let's get the demand going. The replicability and scalability of compliance markets globally, when we look at actually what works around the world, it's compliance markets, because obviously they're regulated and obviously they're telling business that they have to move. We don't have enough of them. The US obviously has very large compliance markets. And we have 2 in England, B&G and nutrient neutrality. But there is sort of a global sense that we need to have probably more of these, but they take quite a lot of time to set up. So can we replicate and scale them just quicker? The development of biodiversity credits or certificate schemes at a national level, as I sort of alluded to, if we're going to have these targets, if we've got TNFD, how can you start creating a bit of a voluntary schemes around offsets for biodiversity credits? It's not something I love, if I'm honest, but it's another pot of money that could come in if it's kept high integrity. Standards to ensure confidence. And then in blues, I've put sort of, back to the investment side, we want favourable terms on the upfront finance for project deliverers, and we want some risk sharing for delivery. Nature-based solutions, climate and nature scenario development, and those risk assessment for business. I think we need to start moving more towards that CFO type thinking rather than CSO. Support for business groups to share in investment at a regional scale. So sort of aggregated models so that we get rid of this free rider problem, because at the moment some businesses are saying, well, I can pay for natural flood management in my region, but look at all the other businesses who are benefiting and I'm paying for it. So how do we get everyone to sort of come together around a model? Trustworthy data on effectiveness of MBS, and then the same in supply chain transition, climate and nature scenario development and risk assessments, and consumer demand. We hear from some large corporates who say, well, we priced out what it will cost to transition the farmers in our supply chain, and it's actually not that much, relatively speaking, but we know that consumers won't pay more, and so we're never going to make it back, and therefore I can't convince my CFO for us to do it, because it's in the millions, rather than, like 100,000, so while the CFO is saying do it out of a marketing budget, you can't pay 10 million out of a marketing budget, but if consumers won't pay more, and in fact, one particular supermarket said they lost market share when they transitioned out of plastics, which, obviously is not great news for CFOs. So how do we get that consumer demand up? And then some of the top, some sort of underpinning of all of this, so TNFD, we have the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, that's moving towards being integrated into ISSB and hopefully mandated within ISSB. As in the UK government might mandate the standard to be adopted by 2027. We have nature positive pathways, which we hope will start development next year. Taxonomy, we have in the UK green taxonomy, but it's going through a consultation period, and I think we need to sort of show that we really need taxonomies, and then obviously shareholder pressure as well. So there's a lot I've covered in that, and then I really wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. So I think we've got about 8 minutes of questions. So I'll take a beat there, and I have some other slides if anything comes up. I'm having trouble seeing anyone with this light. So I just wondered, are there any questions? Does anyone want me to go a bit slower and talk about any of the points that I've made? Oh. Is that a no? Oh, thank you. Sorry, Helen Brandy. I forgot that there were some coming in there, of course.
So one question is, it's clear lots of research is still needed on the market demand, but where do you think the funding for the research should come from?
I don't know, to be honest. We're struggling. We're not for profit, and I have a very small team with a very thin budget. And there's the challenge we have with philanthropy is that they don't quite buy into, one, nature. They like climate. So now we're starting to talk about climate adaptation, but nature-based solutions is what we're really saying. And the other is they're not really into piping, like the piping that's needed. It's more, some of it, I've never really understood why. Maybe it's nicer and shinier, maybe it's because of the urgency of what we're facing, but they'll prefer to pay for conservation projects that get money out the door very quick, but aren't changing the actual system. So there are a couple of funders that we have, we think, do get that message, but we've really, really struggled. I know from our experience of coming up against philanthropy that huge budgets go out to academic institutions. I know they don't go far, but I would, if you are able to make that argument to philanthropy, then that would be wonderful, because we have not been able to really make that argument to philanthropy as yet about the piping that's needed. So sorry, I'm not more helpful with you there. UKRI is the other one.
Yeah, so we've got one that's around, what do you think of biodiversity credits?
Oh gosh. Sophus, I think you should answer this one. Whatever Sophus thinks. My CEO sits on the IEPB, so they have an opinion, so I will just say my own. I think we need a measuring tool, and so for biodiversity, and I think that's where biodiversity certification or credits, whatever you want to call them, can be useful in that development. And so I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I absolutely don't think they should be traded in secondary markets, and I don't anticipate that is the model that we're going towards. So I think their development is useful, but I think we're not really sure yet about how they're going to be used. As we all know, biodiversity is at a local level, and so I can't see how we would have a global market. And so that's my very wishy-washy answer to that one.
Okay, got another question. It's a bit of a long one. Okay, so is it a tragedy of the commons problem for businesses that there's no balance sheet incentives for an individual business to invest in nature-based solutions unless all other businesses do too?
Yeah. So on nature positive pathways, we're asked to do it by business. They've just said we want everyone to have to do it. So we have probably about 25 businesses, really large businesses in the UK across sectors who've expressed interest or signed statements of support. We don't need them to, because I think government understands that this is where they want to go, but we wanted to show that actually business is moving towards it, just in case any politics changes at any time. We can show that this is born of business incentive. The same with TNFD. It's really interesting, actually, businesses calling it for it to be mandated. I don't anticipate TNFD is going to be mandated. I think it will go through the ISSB route. It has been mandated in one country. But again, it's about levelling the playing field for businesses. It's different for small and medium enterprises, and I know TNFD is coming out with some advice for SMEs. But I think we need to level the playing field.
Okay, I know you said you're not quite confident in what we actually ecologists do, but there's one question which is kind of what I've been thinking this session should be for, but seeing how ecologists fit into it, and what can ecologists do from your perspective, do you think, to enhance this?
I don't know. I'd love to hear from you what you think you could do. That's really, like, it's something I feel like I have a massive gap on, and I think the whole of my peers, not my peers, but the people we work with across corporates and FIs also don't fully understand. Yeah. Helen. I don't know if anyone can share. I think there's a hand here. Are we able to?
Oh God. Fancy?
I think just being more open and interested in collaborating and trying to understand each other's language. You mentioned taxonomy, that's really important, and I think there's still a lot of kind of different parties feeling that there's no engagement coming from the other party, when actually it's just people not really talking to each other well enough. And I think we have a few sessions later on that talk about communication and that specific issue as well.
And did you have an idea?
I had a discussion about the relationship between biology and business, and one of the ideas we came up with is some sort of evidence base of what are corporate actions that business can take, and what are the biodiversity outcomes on the ground.
Right.
And trying to make that connection. It's like, if you do spend X amount on this as a business, this leads to some kind of evidence-based thing that, okay, it leads to this amount of stuff. And I think that's something as ecologists we could really help with. Very similar to the conservation evidence stuff. Just a really
Yeah. Well, I think that's, so for the nature positive pathways to be developed, I mean, it has to be developed with ecologists and research. I mean, it just can't be developed any other way. So I'm hoping that connection you've just said will start to be made then. Yeah, I mean, it's not for us or WWF to determine what those pathways are. We're not ecologists or environmental economists, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much again,
Thanks.
Helen, for joining us. And our next speaker is Tim Lam, speaking on holding big business to task on ecosystem restoration.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Really exciting to be here. I've been looking forward to this session for ages. Thank you, Helen and Franzi, for pulling us all together, because I think what's really exciting about this session is that we've got a real diversity of speakers. So thank you, Helen, wherever you've gone, for your talk, and particularly for being brave enough to admit that you're not really sure what ecologists do and what ecologists might contribute, because I'm an ecologist, and so I'm going to tell you what I do and what I think we can contribute to this area. In a nutshell, I think that ecologists have a role to play in holding businesses to account on this stuff, in describing what ecosystem restoration looks like when it's done well, and then trying to identify mechanisms to ensure that when businesses engage in this, they do it well. I'm going to tell you about this paper that we did and some of the work that we're continuing in this theme to try and tackle this question. As I start, I'd like to thank my fantastic team of co-authors. This is a really diverse team of people who work on lots of different ecosystems, in lots of different contexts, in lots of different types of organization, in lots of different geographies. And that diversity has really been key to the success of this project in helping us to understand this from a global perspective. So thank you to them and also to the funders who have generously helped us make this work happen. So I mentioned I'm an ecologist. I'd like to share a little bit about my background so you understand where I'm coming at this question from. So I'm a coral reef ecologist, and coral reef ecologists over the last 5 or 10 years have seen a lot of degraded ecosystems. This was a headline that came out during the first year of my PhD while I was doing fieldwork on the Great Barrier Reef. So we talk a lot about severely degraded systems. We also talk a lot about ecosystem restoration. And there's been lots written in the field of coral reef ecology about what ecosystem restoration looks like, what it can achieve, what it can't achieve, how we might take different approaches on it. And what's particularly interesting in the world of coral reefs is that what some of the leaders in ecosystem restoration to date have been businesses. So, for example, the Mars pet care business is a massive global business that has delivered the largest in spatial scale, the longest running, and by lots of people's metrics, the most ecologically successful coral reef restoration project that we have. I've been working on this project for some years, and my role is in a team of ecologists who tries to evaluate the success of this program in delivering recovery of coral reefs. So we measure things like reef carbonate budgets and soundscapes and habitat complexity, and we try and understand whether the system is recovering. And in a lot of these metrics, it is recovering quite well. This is a program that's working quite well. So that's got me thinking, and it got us thinking that corporations could lead on nature recovery. And that's because lots of businesses, like Mars, have a motive to make nature recovery work. They've got a business interest. They've got a vested interest in natural systems that continue to work well and provide the natural resources that they need. And it really matters to them what people think of them and whether they're going to meet these legal requirements on nature restoration that are coming down the road for them. And as well as having a motive, they've got an ability. And they've got a lot of money, they've got a lot of people, and they've got a lot of expertise in making things happen and making things happen quickly. And those are all things you need if you want to restore an ecosystem effectively at scale. The question is, do they lead on nature recovery? And this is a question I think that's important because we know there's a lot of sort of enthusiasm, a lot of vague enthusiasm in the business world around this stuff. And you can see that just by wandering around the supermarket, right? You try and buy a crate of beer, and from one brand, they're telling you they're planting seagrass. Another brand's going to plant trees for you. If you buy some cat food, you're getting coral planted, right? If you buy an air ticket, you're going to plant some mangroves. And if you buy a television contract, then you're helping the rainforests. And we see this all over the place. And my friends know that I work as an ecologist in nature recovery, and I was getting more and more texts like this from my friends. And I realized to my horror that I had no idea how to reply to them. And I thought, well, blimey, if I can't reply to these texts and I work in the sector, how is anybody meant to know about this? And that's important, that matters. Because if we don't have transparency, then firstly, consumers can't make educated decisions about which businesses they want to support. Secondly, we can't regulate these companies if we don't know what they're doing. Thirdly, we can't track progress. All these sort of big global targets we have on ecosystem restoration, 30 by 30, all that stuff. Businesses are big players, and if we don't know what they're doing, then we can't track global progress. And fourthly, we can't share learning. We can't take successful and good examples of businesses leading nature recovery and map them onto other systems. So we really need better transparency. So we started this side research project, which I guess was trying to just answer the text questions I was getting from my friends. That was our objective. And so the first thing we needed was a sample. And so we looked for a sample, a cohort of globally influential businesses we could look at. And so we came across this Fortune 500 data set. It's a listing of 500 of the world's biggest publicly listed companies. And to make sure that we had a balance of companies working in different industry sectors, we split this by industry sector into 10 different sectors and took the 10 biggest companies in each of those 10 sectors to get a sample of 100 of the world's biggest businesses. We then looked at their sustainability reports to see what they were claiming to do in the field of ecosystem restoration. And lots of them were making a noise, as we knew from walking around the supermarket. Lots of them were claiming to carry out ecosystem restoration, 2/3 of them. But when we looked for any detail at all about what they were doing, it was really lacking. So the lowest bar we set was just tell us something about how much you're doing, the area covered, the number of trees you've planted, anything that tells us how much ecosystem you've restored. And only 2/3 of us could tell, 2/3 of them told us anything about that. It's a pretty low bar. And then when we asked about budget, when we looked in these reports to see how much are you spending, what did it cost, only 1/5 had any information about that. And then this is the one that really breaks my heart. When we asked about ecological monitoring and outcomes, only half of them mentioned that they're doing any monitoring, and only 4 of them mention any outcome. 66 businesses claiming to invest in nature recovery, and only 4 telling us what the impact was on nature. That's woeful. So that was the end of phase 1, and it was pretty demoralizing. So then we moved into phase 2 of the project, and we asked the question, well, what would good look like? If businesses were reporting well on this, what would a good report look like? And so with this team of co-authors with all their different diverse expertise, we asked that question, and after lots of Zoom calls and wrangling over different options, we came up with a set of 7 principles from restoration science that we thought if businesses were reporting well, the information they were telling us would give us information against all of these principles of good practice. And then we looked through the reports to see how many were hitting. And so here's some, you can see the exact definitions of each principle in the paper, or I can talk to you about them afterwards. But here's some examples of good practice reporting that tells us some information about these principles. So for instance here, we've got a report that tells us some monitoring information. How many insects, what recovery did we see in the insect population? It tells us something about the permanence. It tells us how long they're monitoring this progress for. And there's stuff about control plots in there. So we're seeing something about reference ecosystems. That's all quite encouraging. And then in this one, we're seeing stuff about proportionality. We know how big their sites are. And we're seeing, again, monitoring information. We know what the survival rate is. And in this one, we've got some information about how they're trying to ensure that there's inclusive governance and how they're measuring the external benefits to people of these programs. So that's all quite good. But then lots of them were really quite discouraging, like this. We'll plant 1 million trees every year. What trees? Where are they? When did you plant them? Did they survive? Nobody knows. We carried out a children's tree planting campaign. Same lack of information, but now we've got people who are unskilled and untrained doing the planting. So great. And then the wonderful activities promoting harmony with nature. Woo, lovely. So lots of these reports struggled to hit any of these principles. And here's the summary stats when we looked across all 100 reports. And the numbers are pretty demoralizingly low. But let me be optimistic here for a minute, because none of these bubbles are 0. That's really important. The reason that's important is because that proves that this is possible. Yeah? If any of these were zero, then it might be impossible for businesses to report on this stuff, but none of them are zero. And that tells us that businesses can report on this stuff well, because there is a real-world example for every principle of a business doing a good job of this. And so armed with that encouraging proof of concept, we've now been going into the third phase of this project, which is still ongoing. We're trying to work out how as a bunch of ecologists we can influence policy and practice to improve the way that businesses report on this activity. So we've been trying a bunch of different stuff, and I would welcome your suggestions in what else we can do. So for instance, we've been running workshops where we invite specific people who we think will be influential to come and help work on this with us. I've been going and doing talks in business meetings and trade fairs, and I even put on a suit once, desperate times. And we've been doing podcasts, and we've been working with these organizations, some of which work directly with businesses. And the hope there is by changing the behavior of individual influential businesses, we can then create a ripple effect where others, businesses in the same sector, will copy them, and we'll sort of see good practice spread through a sector. And then we've also been working with organizations that write policy and write guidelines which businesses follow when they do this reporting. So we think if the guidelines get better, then maybe the practice gets better. So I've only been doing this about a year. This is a work in progress, and I would love to chat to the diverse group of experts we have in this room about what else we might do in this area. So as I close, you can download the paper there, and I'm delighted to answer any of your questions, but I would like to leave you with my question, and I hope you can help me with this. And that is, how do we get these principles of good ecosystem restoration, how do we get them into the policy that governs how businesses report on their activity? And then once it's in policy, how do we make sure businesses follow that policy and get it into the practice, the way they actually report? And then how do we make sure that that change in their reporting behavior turns into a real-world outcome on the ground? I think that together, if we can answer these questions well, we can help businesses become a force for good in nature recovery around the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, but maybe we first go to your questions if there's anybody in the audience who would like to respond.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk, Amy Principal from the Office for Environment Protection. I'm really interested in the context in which the nature restoration activities were occurring. Were they primarily voluntary activities? Were they statutory obligations?
Yeah, great question. And when I first started going through these reports, I had a spreadsheet of loads of different variables that I was going to draw out of all these reports. And that exactly was one of them. Is this voluntary, or is this a sort of extra bonus? We don't have to, but we're doing it because, we want to. And many of those columns that I wanted to fill out, like that one, there was just no information. So we don't know, and I'm afraid that is the answer for loads of other questions that lots of other people have asked me, about the details of these, and so I think that is another thing that we need to know: how much of this is driven by sort of legal requirements, and how much is driven by philanthropy or a want to go beyond legal requirements. Great question. I'm afraid I have no answer.
There's one question online. To what extent do you think that the ESG scoring frameworks used to inform sustainable investment help to hold businesses to task? Are they part of the bigger picture, or are they too simple and reductive? Yeah,
another good question. And I've just started downloading some of the results of those scoring frameworks. And what I intend to do is look at the way we've scored them and then look at the results from these ESG scoring frameworks and see what correlation there is. So I don't know, if you give me your email, I'll let you know how we get on with that in a couple of months' time. That's a direction that I think we need to go in to understand the effectiveness of these scoring frameworks.
And then another one, is mass investment in coal recovery at a level or scale that hits their balance sheet? Or is it from marketing budget, CSR scale? Where did they come in your phase 1 study?
Yeah, so it's marketing. And it's sustainability budgets. They have quite a big budget for that compared to lots of companies, so it's quite a big coral restoration project, but it's marketing. And we didn't include them in this cohort because they're a family-owned business. So they're not in the same bracket as the businesses we analyse, which are publicly listed.
Great, thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately, but there was one suggestion to you to get invited to Davos.
Well, yeah, well, that would be fun, but no one's invited me yet. So. Thank you all very much. Delighted to chat afterwards.
So can we have our next speaker, who is Sofa Sue Gasson, and he's presenting on the current state, challenges and opportunities for private investment in biodiversity in Europe.
Super, thank you. Yeah, real pleasure to be here. It's so cool. I now see what Helen was saying about it being completely blinding. Yeah, Helen, where do I go for my biodiversity credit stuff? To the hosts of this session. Right? That's where I get all my information from. It's from the Nottingham team who actually do this work. I just contribute to review papers, but they actually do this stuff, right? So this is where I go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about making nature markets work in the 21st century. I've been studying nature markets for most of the last decade. I specialize in impact evaluations and understanding the governance arrangements of nature markets around the world, with a focus on the UK, Australia, the international biodiversity and international voluntary carbon markets. In short, I'm going to give a 12-minute talk that asks that firstly, for a kind of a more generalist audience, gives you a little introduction to how you can make money from nature. Then I'll ask a couple of really important questions that all ecologists should be asking if they want to maximize the benefits of nature markets. One, if you pay for a unit of nature, is it real? And the second one is, if you pay for a unit of nature, can anyone actually check if you're delivering it or do anything about it if you're not? Now, these are really important things because there's always this chance with nature markets that essentially, if you pay for something that either would have been delivered anyway, or if you pay for something that's totally non-compliant with the standards that it's supposed to be delivering, then what you're doing is not actually improving nature at all. It's just a transfer payment, right? You are just paying, you're just transferring money to a project implementer who is not delivering the specific service that you're asking for. Okay, so there's some important high-level policies that are driving supposedly increased investment in nature via nature markets. The main one is that it is actually fundamentally embodied in the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. There's a target to mobilize at least $200 billion a year, primarily through leveraging private finance, promoted blended finance, and stimulating innovative schemes such as green bonds, biodiversity offsets, and credits. I found this very interesting because at the time that the Kunming-Montreal Agreement was actually approved, biodiversity credits basically didn't exist yet, and yet they were still embodied in our high-level UN policy framework. Incredible. EU restoration law, I'm seeing a lot of work and talking to a lot of governments around the European Union who are talking about how they can expand nature markets to achieve their EU restoration law objectives. In the UK, we've got the Nature Markets Framework, which aims to upscale investment to about £1 billion a year, I think, by 2030. Then we've got these potential drivers of investment like the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. Now, the first thing to say is, what is nature finance? Most people just assume, it's a kind of thing. Maybe it's businesses investing in nature. But basically, this is an interesting paper that reviewed a large sample of the world's of self-labeled nature-based solutions investment funds and worked out what they were actually investing in. And basically, you can see that second headline there is a horrible slide, but the lack of ability to monetize adaptation-related benefits does mean that projects are skewed towards those that deliver either traditional commercial revenues or carbon-related returns. So that is code for basically these things are investing in sustainable agriculture, so organic agriculture or sustainable forestry. That's what the finance sector calls nature-based solutions investment. So it's not conservation investment like you would recognize. What are nature markets in practice? Well, I did a PhD on biodiversity offset markets, and then I did a postdoc in nature finance, and I really hoped it would be something different, but it actually wasn't. It turns out that basically nature markets are just offset markets, voluntary carbon offsets, but mostly national biodiversity compliance markets. So basically, how do they work? Well, you've got some nature, and you do a development that impacts on nature, and that leads to some kind of loss of nature, and then you'll pay a land manager to compensate for that loss of nature. Finance gets involved. Helen did a really good job of explaining this. Finance is actually not involved in the top system at all, but in the bottom system, if somebody needs to borrow money to implement the intervention that they can then sell credits from, they might borrow that from finance, from a financial intermediary. And then they'll sell the credits, and then they have to pay back some of that investment to the financial intermediary. So that's where finance fits into these markets. Okay, if you pay for the thing, is it real? So the really fundamental insight from the last 50 years of nature markets research, they've been applied since the 1970s, they're not anything new, is that we suffer from very serious additionality, adverse selection problems in nature markets. Okay, so the fundamental economic theory behind this is, that people opt into delivering services in nature markets when their opportunity costs are low. Right? This basically means that people, when you are creating a market and you ask people to voluntarily opt in to deliver land management activities, you will systematically attract people who would have been doing something similar anyway, right? Because that is what all of the economic incentives in the system are telling you. So, ex post evaluations of every nature market that has ever been studied have all detected widespread non-additionality. Right? Additionality rates varying from 0 to pretty low to the best performing system in the world is the US wetland mitigation system, which actually had pretty high additionality. But the international voluntary carbon market, only about 20% of international of carbon credits through the international voluntary carbon market are real, represent real emissions reductions, and we've got other systems that have got lower effectiveness than this. Right? So, if you're designing a nature market, you need to design a nature market with this very first insight. Most of the people who opt into your system will not be delivering additional outcomes. So you need to implement some kind of checks and balances to make sure that you only allow people into your system if they're delivering additionality, right? Okay, I'll give you a nice example. This is Australia's, or Victoria in Australia's biodiversity offsetting system. We did this evaluation to basically ask, what is the additionality of Australia's, of Victoria's biodiversity offsetting system? It's a couple of $100 million Australian dollars that are transacting through this system. We took all the different offsets. About 80% of them are aiming to protect existing forest and slow down the deforestation rate on existing forests. And about 20% of them are aiming to actually restore forests. And what we found was that about 80% of the system does nothing, so it systematically protects forests that would never have been cleared anyway. And 20% of the system, depending on the way you do the stats, might do a little bit, but it might be restoring a little bit of forest that would not have otherwise been restored. But this is these results are quite common across impact evaluations of nature markets. So the first one is there was no difference between offsets and control sites for about half of our sites. Controls actively outperformed offsets 22% of the time, but offsets outperform controls about 30% of the time. So for 7 individual offsets, they actually worked well. They did a good job at preventing the loss of forest. But if we want these nature markets to deliver additional gains, we basically only want them to select for this thing, and we basically don't want them to select for all that other stuff. That's how we create good nature markets. Is it real unsuitable proxies? I'm going to go to English biodiversity net gain here. So it's a new approach to planning and land management which aims to leave biodiversity in a measurably better state than it was before. Mandatory as of February this year. Basically every new development in England needs to leave biodiversity 10% better off than it was beforehand, and 10% is of course measured using an Excel spreadsheet. Basically, this is the way it works. An ecologist will go out to a site and they'll look at the area of habitats within a potential development site. They'll break down the development site into all the different habitat types within that site, and they'll look at the area of those. They'll look at what habitat type they are according to the UK habitats classification, and they'll score what condition they're in, basically following a dichotomous key. And this will give you the number of units at that site, and then you have to make sure that that number goes up by 10%. Biodiversity net gain is hugely better than the existing planning system that it supersedes. Hugely better, right? Biodiversity net gain is a modification to the Town and Country Planning Act, and what it formally does is it means that you have to measure biodiversity as part of the planning system, and that number has to go up by 10%. It has serious flaws, but it is vastly better than the system it supersedes, which basically neglected biodiversity entirely. In the National Planning Policy Framework, we were all supposed to be delivering net gains in biodiversity. That was the wording. But there was no way of measuring it, and so there was absolutely no way of enforcing it. So it's a big improvement. But this is work that Natalie Duffus at the University of Oxford has done from PhD fieldwork, visiting over 40 sites to actually look at real observed measures of biodiversity in these sites by counting ground invertebrates and comparing this with the biodiversity metric, England's biodiversity metric, and this finds no correlation between the two. This replicates a result by Cicely Marshall, published earlier this year, which uses a different data source. So 2 independent papers now have basically found that there is no correlation between real observed biodiversity and England's biodiversity metric. Cicely's paper finds that species richness does correlate, but it's actually endogenous, so it actually determines the condition score, so that it's not quite a fair comparison. Okay, so why are our biodiversity metrics that underpin our nature markets not working? Well, because there's this fundamental tension in implementing nature markets between their ease of use and what we would call their ecological realism as ecologists. So I often get this back. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, so forth. But like what I try and tell people is we've got 50 years of experience, and when you create a market and you know it's imperfect right from the start, you've got to accept something that has an exploitable structural weakness. That's the way that I see it. So if you know a priori, right before you start, that there's all these flaws, you know that somebody is going to exploit these flaws. Now, biodiversity markets are almost never trying to optimize for biodiversity. They are nearly always implemented as part of national or state planning systems, and they are nearly always trying to implement other competing political objectives. So that's an important thing, right? As ecologists, you think a biodiversity market is optimizing for biodiversity. It is not. It is trading off against other major political objectives, most commonly, which is streamlining the planning system. Okay? Now, the last one is, what's the compliance rate like in nature markets? So this is a paper we did a few years ago that looked at biodiversity offsets around the world and asked what the compliance rate was. Compliance rates with ecological performance standards in the US, they vary around 50%, so that means they're not achieving quite a lot of their ecological performance standards. The worst evaluation is this one, absolutely horrible paper by Lucille Bezombers, that was an evaluation of biodiversity offsets in Isère in France, and that found that 30% of them didn't exist. So that's pretty bad. Now, in biodiversity, again, in England, we've done this work to try and quantify how many of the biodiversity units within the market we think are at extreme risk of non-compliance, of non-delivery. I can talk to you about this in detail later. I have limited time. But basically, we think it's about a quarter. 1/4 of the units we think are unrealistic promises of higher condition habitats within the built environment in the future. And there's lots of really sensible reasons, governance reasons why we don't think that this stuff that's promised in the future, delivered within the built environment, is actually particularly legally enforceable. So we think that's about a quarter of the market that is at extreme risk of non-compliance. And in this paper, one of the things we do is we ask, okay, so if the nature market excluded all of these things that it literally does not have the capacity to ensure will happen, and we delivered these through more robust governance mechanisms instead, well, we estimate we could increase the amount of money flowing through the English nature market by a factor of 4, just by basically not permitting, by banning, these obviously non-compliant units. Okay? Now, compliance in nature markets is pretty bad. There's literature from all around the world that replicates these results. Sebastian Theis did amazing work in the US wetland mitigation system, showing that over half of all credits sold through US wetland mitigation banks are sold within the first 3 years of those things working. They're supposed to work forever. So if they generate half their revenues within the first 3 years, that suggests that maybe they don't have a structural incentive to ensure their long-term ecological integrity. Meg Evans has got some absolutely incredible work looking at the nature markets in Australia that shows that essentially they did not have enough capacity in the planning system to actually make them work, and so they did this thing where they pushed the basically offsets and the confirmation of offset strategies past the stage where planning was actually approved into a kind of non-democratic space where it was then left to developers to implement it, but without democratic oversight. And there's lots of different areas of biodiversity finance where similar issues apply. There's a wonderful paper by Ben Thompson at Monash University that looks at the key performance indicators behind conservation impact bonds, which are not nature markets, but are financial instruments for drawing revenues into conservation. And this is also really interesting, finds that those key performance indicators that financiers use to see if something is ecologically effective, you wouldn't even recognize them as a key performance indicator as an ecologist. So there's a real mismatch there. Okay, I'm out of time. We've done some work on how you can design scientifically credible nature markets. The basic idea of this is we think that there's now sufficient evidence to suggest that if you basically create a biodiversity credit or a unit based on an upfront projection of what biodiversity will look like in the future, and you don't have extremely careful processes for managing vested interest in the crediting process, you are nearly always going to systematically overcredit. So in this we come up with a proposal for only releasing, actually in this case it's nature-based carbon credits, after they've already been proven to work. We think this could fundamentally change the structural incentives in the system. Okay, so if you want nature markets to work, make sure the thing that you're buying is real and is based on real data. If you can't guarantee that they'll work, you need a system that ensures that you'd find out and some kind of governance in place to make sure that it's delivered. Yeah? And then this last one is other work that we've done in the European Union. Okay, so that's my takeaways. This is what I think is required in order to create scientifically robust nature markets for the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but if people can ask them on the apps, you could potentially reply to them on there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Hannah Rotman, talking about saving Scotland's rainforest with many partners and natural capital finance.
Hi everyone, I'll just let this gang leave. Thanks, Franzi, and thanks, Helen, for inviting me. I'm a senior research fellow at James Hutton Institute, a small Scottish interdisciplinary research institute. It's got a focus on nature-based solutions, but I wear a couple of other hats as well, which I'll disclose just for transparency. I'm co-chair of the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital, and I'm also an executive director of a company that is developing nature-based solutions called Highlands Rewilding. Today, I am here with the hat of the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, of which I'm a member. And I'm going to present a case study to you to explain how we are saving Scotland's rainforest with natural capital finance and with many partners.
There's a number of threats that are really significant to the rainforest at the moment.
We have to do something to actually protect some of these remaining pockets.
It would be a tragedy to lose these woodlands.
There's no question about it, the rainforests are seriously threatened.
So very beautiful biodiversity through the mosses and lichens and epiphytes. I'm sure some of you who are field ecologists will have noticed a few midge in that video as well. The rainforest zone is in that west coast of Scotland. It's about 18,500 kilometres squared. But actually, within that, there's only 30,000 hectares of temperate rainforest left. So it's small fragments, it's not connected, and it faces several threats, non-native species such as Rhododendron ponticum, and overgrazing by herbivores such as deer. The Alliance tries to restore all of Scotland's rainforest, and we're trying to double its size, we're trying to link it up. We think that will cost £500 million, and there's not much public funding to help with that. The Alliance is a voluntary partnership, so we're an adhocracy. We don't have any formal constitution. We're a broad range of public sector organisations, ENGOs, a few private sector organisations in there, and then academic institutions. None of us really work outside of public sector models of governance, and our our governance models would have difficulty interacting with private finance, private natural capital. But in fact, we have already been approached directly by investors offering us tens of millions of quid. But we know that we need a business model to show them, and we know that we then need a governance mechanism in order to be able to accept those natural capital funds. And we're working on how that could work currently. But first, what we decided to do was to build up a kind of system of models and guidelines that all the different projects across the whole of that rainforest zone could use. And so we pulled together different communities, communities of practice, land managers, the Alliance's partners, researchers, ecology, charities, communities of interest and science, and most essentially, the rainforest local communities of place, the people around the rainforest who all understand what it takes and can tell us how much it would cost for us to restore that habitat. Now, can anyone observant tell me what meal the otters were just enjoying? No one noticed. All right, so the Nature Tech gives us a little bit of extra metadata that shows us, I'm being very seasonal here. Come on, I can't believe you didn't notice this. It's Christmas lunch. Anyway, we also wanted to research whether Nature Tech could help us in assessing and verifying the positive impact of rainforest restoration work on biodiversity, and B, a governance mechanism for the projects. And Nature Tech, of course, that term that encompasses the application of modern technology. And we think it probably has a case for being in nature restoration projects because it can make the case for bigger investments, not just from charismatic shots like that, but because with Nature Tech we can provide lots of better verified triangulated data. I also mentioned that we'd made all of those project governance mechanisms as well, the standards, the indicators that projects would use. And that's not just individual rainforest restoration projects, it's all of them across the landscape-wide programme that the Alliance is trying to build out. They're linked there. You don't have to read that, it's too boring to read. That's also too boring to read. But it's what we're needing to apply to the business case because we've got such fragmented ownership across the project. We've got a broader range of potential investors. We are having to operate across a number of ecosystem services as well. So we've been busy, as I said, building that business case, and I'll show some of that next. But the investment will need to be repaid through the sale of ecosystem services, and some of that will have to be created through the existing and emerging standards that are mapped on this slide here. The initial focus of the project will be carbon, and that will either be as removal credits validated through the UK's Woodland Carbon Code. We don't know if there's going to be something like BNG in Scotland yet. We also might sell other credits, I guess, as they emerge. High integrity biodiversity codes are emerging. So don't worry about imbibing all of this slide as well. We'll pull out some of the stats as I just go through the case study. What you can see here is that we modelled the cost. This is just one area of that west coast of Scotland, an area called South Knapdale. It's about 2,800 hectares. And what we want to do is make new woodland. The project will expand and protect the native woodland habitat, and that's shown in green on the map. The red boundary is South Knapdale. In purple, we've got new broadleaf habitat areas of expansion, and that's the sort of areas of opportunity, if you like. And you can see that that would increase coverage from 9 to 18% of South Knapdale. So it would double the rainforest there. And it could generate, that project, 260,000 carbon credits. And that's over 40 years, though. It's using the Woodland Carbon Codes methodology, and that 40-year project would cost £41.7 million in total to deliver. Why? Native species will be planted. Each sapling has a cost. The silviculture over the early years to look after the young trees will be quite high. And then the project will also have to keep maintaining that. I guess with our maintenance methods, we're thinking that less invasive species, Rhododendron ponticum, less deer, is going to be more bryophytes, lichens, and epiphytes. But again, there are then decisions within that business model about how much of that we do. The more we do, the more the project costs. It costs 6.6 million just to manage rhododendron in the new woodland areas, those purple spots on the map. If we did the whole area, the green areas and the purple areas, that would cost 13 million. That's double, but it's probably worth the risk of not having to deal with the reinfestation of rhododendron from not doing it across the whole area. So things to think about. And because it was getting a bit depressing thinking about all those things, I thought I'd show you what the nature tech told us. The camera traps at the Rainforest Reserve are of course helping us to work out the deer densities and to see if their management through culling is working. So the available public funding for that project through woodland creation schemes and so on would probably contribute about £10.1 million. So that funding gap remains, and it's £30.7 million for this project. So we're going to have to sell ecosystem services for the new woodland in the form of high integrity carbon credits and the other nascent emerging biodiversity credits as well. We think that the carbon credits can be sold early in the life cycle as pending issuance units at carbon market prices that are current now to cash flow the project as shown by the graph. We'll have to hold 20% of the credits back as a buffer. Maybe they can be sold later at the vintage of this project, which would probably be 2040. So they're sold at those 2040 prices. Now, if we don't do that, then we're going to have to find a long-term loan at low in interest rates, if anyone knows anywhere you can get one of those at the moment, please come forward immediately. But, I mean, I think private finance is interested in this. It has to, though, get an IRR, a return that enables it to give a patient loan, and that's at least 10%. So that is a high level of annual return to need to make. You wouldn't be able to make it until year 10 at the earliest, and by then you've had to incur all of the project cost up front. So these aren't easy projects to get through. But, you know, we think that even with the number of partners that we've got, that we would manage to get a kind of governance model and that we would manage to agree this business model to enable us all to work together to achieve that. So the business modelling project is ongoing, and it's been made possible by the Facility for Investment Ready Nature in Scotland grant programme delivered by Nature Scot and in partnership with the National Lottery Heritage Fund. I said those things out loud and I've done my duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we also don't have time for questions, but there are a few for you online to answer, Hannah.
So our next speaker is Shazoda Alec Hanover.
I'll make sure I have the timer on. Hello, everyone. I've just finished my PhD where I was working on exploring the potential of nature-based solutions in dryland ecosystems and specifically in the RLC region. So my case study is very specific, and as you might have noticed, it is based in one of the countries of the global south. And as part of my research, I was trying to look at human-nature connection and relations. So a little bit of the background. RLC, you might have heard about it before, but used to be one of the fourth largest inland water bodies in the world, which started vanishing in the 60s. The annual estimated fish catch was about 30 to 40,000 tons, and which is interesting, the sea used to be in Central Asia, and the fish canning factory used to export fish even to Russia. The sea itself supported about 60,000 job places and used to act as a climate regulator in the region. It is located in one of the dryland regions, and what used to be shared by two countries, former post-Soviet countries, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. What happened? Since 1960s, because of water resources mismanagement and misuse, the sea, which is basically a lake, started vanishing, and now we have lost about 90% of the surface area, and about the volume also decreased by 40 times. As a result, we have multiple consequences. We have desertification, we have a new desert now, which spans about 3 million hectares of area. We have massive soil salinization, air pollution, reduced employment opportunities, increase in morbidity rates and other health issues and risks. And also we have migration caused by this ecological catastrophe. I was trying to explore the potential of come up actually with a list of potential nature-based solutions that could help tackle some of the consequences of this catastrophe. And as you know, nature-based solutions, to be effective, they need to address some of the societal challenges. They need to be site-specific. They need to consider cultural, traditional contexts, and they should involve stakeholders, especially those who are impacted by the consequences of degradation. And last but not least, they should also be economically viable. So the research that we did included basically a social survey that covered, so we actually wanted to know how frequently people use natural resources which are heavily degraded. How do they value those resources? Do they see any changes in the state of those natural resources over the past 10 years? And we also tried to figure out the link between resources and well-being. By well-being, we actually meant the overall satisfaction with life and financial situation of the local population. We also conducted some expert interviews, key expert interviews, and triangulated those results and tried to come up with a list of inclusive, locally tailored nature-based solutions. So the survey area covered a very small town here, which used to be actually along the former shorelines of the sea, the lake. We covered almost more than 400 households, 426 households, and tried to capture about 15% of the population for representativeness. And we did this about 2 years ago. As a result, we were able to cover different age groups with different levels of education and occupation. And we discovered that the population roughly is, the gender ratio is roughly 50 to 50%. But the majority is between the ages of 25 and like 45, which is still considered to be young, because we hypothesized that because of like migration and job loss and these kind of factors, we would have less male, like men than women, but this was not really the case. So what we discovered, so people told us that they do not use any of those resources much, apart from the grasslands, just because the state of those resources are so heavily degraded that they do not see any particular use. And in terms of the values assigned to those resources, we discovered that people still value grasslands, wetlands, wildlife, and forested areas. Forested areas, actually, the desert that has formed in the place of the lake is being covered by trees now, like shrubs. And people think that all those resources have high cultural values. And what is very interesting is that financial values of those resources are also very high, because when they were responding to our questions, they were saying, provided those resources are restored to their previous state, they are able to provide some economic benefits for the local population, who were very much dependent on those resources in the recent past. In terms of the perceived changes in the state of the natural resources, the population is very much aware of the constantly degrading state of the resources, and interestingly, wetlands that, according to the public opinion, wetlands are the resources that degraded the most, and which is why we see here direct connection between livelihoods and income sources and natural resources. Those resources impacted the income sources of the local population directly, and basically more than any other potential resources. And people also see, they do agree, they tend to agree strongly that well-being of the local population, including financial and as well as mental well-being, is directly linked to the state of natural resources. So going back to our topic of nature finance and nature-based solutions, it has been acknowledged that restoring the lake to its previous state is not possible, is not viable, so because of the lack of water resources, obviously. And the main goal is now to help mitigate the consequences of this environmental catastrophe and try to stabilize the environment that has formed there, including the desert ecosystems, and help the local population with the alternative sources of income. So there's an interesting study by the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. This was not done by me. That they discovered that most of the funding in those countries which are in the RLC basin, they come from the state budgets. And there's a growing interest from the private sector side, and the pot, so these are the countries, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are the countries where the RLC is to be. Actually, the pot of funding from international donors is somehow decreasing. Most likely there's a shift in interests, which is why, according to my perspective and observations, private sector will be one of the main funders of nature restoration activities, including the local communities in the region. So there's a huge potential in increasing financial resources in the RLC region, including those that could be funded, supported by the private sector and local communities. So, for instance, in terms of like ecosystem restoration, there's huge potential for wetlands to be restored, for grasslands and rangelands, because they do support local livelihood options, and they do have some cultural historic values. There's also a very interesting opportunity to support ecotourism activities. I know this might sound a bit awkward. How can you support and develop ecotourism in a highly degraded area? But there's huge interest in that, and you still can do that, and thus you can support the local communities that are very much dependent on alternative income sources. The fact that the community awareness is really high, this creates lots of opportunities for community support, provided they are involved in the decision-making process, which is very, very rare case in the region. And I mean, the cost of ecosystem degradation, the RLC degradation, is really, really high in the region. I don't think that it's even possible to quantify, but the cost of restoration activities might be even more than this, and this is a whole new level of discussion, and which is why participatory planning also is one of the instruments of nature finance and nature-based solutions planning activities, but the fact that the governments have not learned to communicate with the communities, local communities yet, gives a lot of provides a lot of discussions and opportunities, and they are still learning to do so. So basically there's huge potential in that, but this might also require additional sources of funding just to train both people and local decision makers to work with each other. This is the paper that we published as part of this research. You can read this, and some other papers on the RLC and drylands and nature-based solutions options. That's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I can't actually see any questions currently on the app, but if anyone's got any, you could potentially shout them out.
Yeah, Sophus?
Thanks so much. So what does ecotourism look like in RLC?
It's basically dark sky tourism, dark sky observation, trekking, so you can, or hiking basically. It's not, well, there are some regions that you cannot reach alone, but you have to hire a local guide, and you are able to stay in tents out in the desert. So the RLC has retreated for like some 120 kilometers from the former shoreline. So basically, if you want to go and still observe the sea or parts of the sea, you can still do that. This is basically it. And also, there are options to to stay in the local homestays and get involved in cultural activities. These are some of the options that we were trying to explore.
In the survey, you showed the perceptions associated with wetland degradation and impacts on income. And I was wondering how well those perceptions lined up with what you can measure.
You mean with the actual state of land use, land cover? Yes, this was actually second part of my research, where I was exploring the satellite images, and trying to see how land use, land cover changed over the past 10 years at least. So this the perception of people, and I mean the local communities, is very much aligned with the real state of the environment. So what they see, what they think, is basically what they can see. I have developed a number of maps in trying to track and identify the changes in this in areas covered by wetlands, and it is perfectly in line with what people perceive. This is why I was talking also about triangulation, because when we were talking to foresters and biodiversity specialists, they have also confirmed the condition of the natural resources.
Great. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Cicely Marshall on long-term consequences of arable rewilding on invertebrates and fungi and their uses biodiversity credit metrics.
Thanks. So I'm presenting a study into the feasibility of using biodiversity credits to rewild marginal arable land in England. The UK has been particularly impacted by biodiversity declines, attributed mainly to changes in farming practices over the last 70 years. A nature recovery solution that's been pioneered by the NEP estate in southern England is the trophic rewilding of marginal arable land. Trophic rewilding emphasises the reintroduction of species with a big impact on ecosystem functioning, like large herbivores, like these Tamworth pigs and red deer, which are established and roam freely at NEP Southern Block. Research into the impacts of rewilding is biased towards above-ground communities, and studies of taxon responses to conditions at NEP are not yet available in the peer-reviewed literature, though there are documented success stories around purple emperors, for example, and storks. Meanwhile, biodiversity credit markets are being promoted as the solution to financing nature recovery at scale. Similar to carbon credits, a biodiversity credit is a tradable unit that represents a positive biodiversity outcome achieved by a project. Biodiversity credits are available from around 35 different providers. There is a leading approach developed by the Wallacea Trust in collaboration with about 35 different collaborators. They define a biodiversity unit as a 1% gain per hectare in the median value of a basket of at least 4 taxon-based and 1 habitat-based metrics. Companies like Replanet use that framework to issue biodiversity credits. The basket of metrics is calculated at the project site and a matched reference site that's already undergone the proposed restoration to predict the expected biodiversity uplift at the project site, and those credits are then issued ex ante. The framework recognises that projects are likely to make use of DNA metabarcoding to identify or quantify those taxon-based metrics, as we do here. The owners of NEP have founded a company to rewild new sites in the UK using their experience at NEP. The project site to be restored is Boothby Farm in Lincolnshire. It was a conventional arable farm growing wheat, beans and barley. The project has been trialling this Wallacea Trust framework as one potential funding stream to fund the restoration, using NEP's Southern Block as the reference site. The sites are reasonably well matched, though Boothby is rainier and has more soil types, but given the proposed NEP-style farm-scale rewilding approach, there is no better reference site. So this is our study setup. We are characterising the expected uplift at Boothby for aerial, terrestrial, soil invertebrates and fungi, being understudied taxa with rich ecological functions, and we're evaluating the potential of the biodiversity credit market to finance that nature restoration. At each site, we set 15 malaise traps to sample aerial invertebrates located in approximate proportion to the habitats and soil types on site. Around each of those, we set 3 pitfall traps to sample the terrestrial invertebrates. My undergraduates, Jack and Hannah, were out carrying out the fieldwork, sampling contemporaneously at the 2 sites in summer 2022. We sampled soil fungi and soil invertebrates at 10 of those 15 sites just to keep costs down a bit. We used these 10 centimetre cubed plastic augers, taking 5 pseudo-replicates across 3 field subsections. So our panel C and D show our sample setup across the 2 sites. We found that biomass was higher at NEP than Boothby for every taxon by 6 to 123%, as we would hope and expect. For malaise and pitfall traps, we weighed dab-dried invertebrates before we sent that catch off for sequencing, for identification. For soil invertebrates, we dug dedicated soil monoliths, sieved out the invertebrates and dry weighed them. And for fungi, we used the number of DNA sequences recovered from the sample as a proxy for abundance. In terms of richness, we found that OTU richness, taxon richness, was 52% higher and 40% higher at NEP than Boothby for aerial and terrestrial invertebrates. Again, that's positive. It's not huge. It's roughly in line with literature values. For soil invertebrates, we found that OTU richness was 42% lower at NEP than Boothby. That's contrary to expectation, but it's not unprecedented in the literature. And for soil fungi, we found non-significant differences in richness at the plot level, although we found recorded more fungi overall at NEP. But again, the literature is actually quite mixed at the moment in terms of what richness patterns we would expect for OTUs across these different habitat types. We want to move beyond richness and biomass if we can. These are ordination results where samples are plotted closer together if they share more species in common. Axis 1 segregates samples by site, meaning that species composition is different at each site. Just 21% of taxa are shared between the sites overall. And then within each site, axis 2 separates the samples by habitat type. For example, in panel D, you can see that woodland samples from both sites have high axis 2 positions. That's those closed circles. We used reference databases to assign OTUs to species names. Panel A shows the invertebrate orders and panel B the fungal orders of the phyla recovered at each site. We found about 1,000 taxa at Boothby and 1,400 taxa at NEP, roughly half invertebrates and half fungi. The coloured circles show standardised residuals from chi-square tests. That tells us, for example, that beetles are overrepresented at Boothby, mainly ground beetles, whereas flies and grasshoppers and crickets are overrepresented at NEP, for example. We looked at the conservation value of the species recorded at each site. Invertebrate species recorded at Boothby had significantly larger UK range sizes than those recorded at NEP, i.e. nationally scarcer species are found at NEP. That's encouraging. For fungi, both sites had a median UK range size of 0. That means that more than half of the species had no records at all in the NBN atlas. We also found more species with a conservation designation recorded at NEP than Boothby. For example, this nationally scarce leafhopper recorded at NEP. And then we defined 3 indicators of ecosystem functioning. So panel C shows that the number of pollinator species is a third higher at NEP than at Boothby, though only as a result of higher species richness at NEP. Panel D is showing the nematode community composition in the soil at Boothby. And at Boothby, that composition is typical of stressed, nitrogen-depleted ecosystems with degraded food webs, whilst the nematode community at NEP is typical of undisturbed ecosystems with mature food web condition. And then finally in panel E, we assigned trophic modes to the fungi that we recorded. NEP had more symbiotrophs and fewer pathotrophs than Boothby, so that's more mycorrhizal fungi and fewer plant pathogens at NEP than Boothby. So again, that's positive. So taking these 3 indicators together is a really positive sign of soil health, plant health, and ecosystem functioning. Which brings us to our biodiversity credit calculation. So these are our 4 taxon metrics and our habitat metric at the end. To calculate the value of each taxon metric, we multiply species richness by abundance for our project site and our reference site, and the percent change between the two gives the predicted uplift for each metric. Abundance raw values are rescaled between 1 and 5 to make it magnitude free. There's a negative weighting for uncertainty, which uses the standard deviation in the abundance measures. The habitat metric, in this case, is the percent change between the baseline and post-recovery biodiversity units at Boothby, calculated using England's statutory biodiversity metric, so that biodiversity net gain statutory metric. The statutory metric has its own prescribed calculation method that's based on habitat distinctiveness and habitat condition. Outside of England, that metric would be substituted with something else habitat-based, like percent tree cover or just plant diversity, maybe. Then we take the median of those 5 values, which in our case is 69.1, reduce it to 80% of its value as a sort of standard buffer that's applied to every project. We would reduce it again by any anticipated project leakage amount, which I've just set to 0 here for simplicity. And then we multiply that number by the project area in hectares to give us a number, which is the number of biodiversity credits that the project is worth, and that's 34,092. The biodiversity credits are trading for around $5 a unit. That's a kind of conservative but realistic amount. And that would make the site worth $170,000 or so. In England, it's now a legal requirement that developers demonstrate that their building sites achieve a 10% net gain in statutory biodiversity units. If they can't manage that on their own, then they have to buy in these units from off-site providers, for example, this Boothby project. Boothby is expected to achieve a surplus of 2,400 biodiversity units from its restoration. Those biodiversity units, statutory biodiversity units in England, trade for around £25,000 at the moment, making the estate worth £60 million. 60 million is a much more realistic figure in terms of funding nature recovery in England. The site alone, just to buy the site, was £30 million. And actually just measuring and documenting the metrics required by the voluntary carbon credit market would absorb all of the site's value on that carbon credit market, the £130,000 or so. What did we learn then? Rewilding is positive for fungal and invertebrate richness, biomass, conservation value, and ecosystem functioning, with estimates in the range of -42% to 167% for our raw indicators. Using the Wallacea Trust framework, we predict a median biodiversity uplift of 69% for our arable farm if trophically rewilded. If sold at current market rates, those credits would fetch a rather modest £130,000, which is very uncompetitive with England's statutory biodiversity market, on which the same site would be worth £60 million. So arable wilding would produce a benefit to nature. A voluntary biodiversity market is not likely to fill the global nature financing gap, at least not alone, and without substantial regulatory support. And with that, thank you to my co-authors, my funders, and to you for listening.
Thank you very much. We have a question online. This farm is in an intensive cereal cropping region. What makes it suitable for rewilding rather than continuing with food production? Is it on poor soil types?
Yes, that's the idea, yes. So the company would always say that they're targeting marginal land that's that's not very productive. The Boothby site is partly on that low productivity soil. It does also have some rather richer soil types, which also rather unfortunately calls into question the validity of using NEP as a reference site. Those ordination results show that the species composition at the two sites is really quite different. Sopha's touched on it as well. It's really difficult to match sites robustly and certainly in a project like this, if you're trying to match the proposed restoration technique as well as baseline conditions and then release those credits ex ante, it's a really risky thing to do in terms of, predicting outcomes.
Just one quick one. BOOFB is worth a huge amount on the BNG market, but has a demand assessment been done to see if that's a feasible amount to get in?
There is demand, yeah. I mean, no, specifically no, but I also do quite a lot of work as environmental consultant, and because it's a statutory market and every developer has to find these 10% off-site units, the units often have to come from off-site, and yes, there's absolutely, everyone's kind of scrabbling around to find these units to buy, to push their projects through the planning system. So yes, I expect that the BOOFB project would be able to sell these units. On the statutory market, the demand side on the voluntary market is very low, which is partly why the credit price is so low. I understand from the company, from Replanet, the demand for the voluntary credits is mainly as a top-up to the carbon markets. So very few businesses or no businesses really want to buy just biodiversity credits, but they will buy them as an add-on to their carbon projects. It's good for carbon sequestration. Oh, and it's also nice for biodiversity. Okay, so a bit of extra revenue rather than as a standalone finance.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, so our next speaker is Franziska Stroth, my colleague and co-organizer of this session. And she will be talking about unlocking the potential of biodiversity data for nature finance, bridging gaps and overcoming barriers.
Thank you. So after we heard about a lot of really inspiring case studies, I'm going to bring you back to the more big picture on nature finance. So we've heard a little bit already about some figures on the state of nature finance, and there are different ones kind of flying around, mainly because of different ways to measure them, and there's no really standard way to do that. But one figure is that biodiversity finance has increased considerably to about 200 billion per year. Importantly, the vast majority of that is by governments and deployed only domestically, not internationally. On the international market, most of the biodiversity finance is in form of debt for nature swaps. So the idea here is that rich countries write off the debt of nature-rich but cash-poor countries. So about 2.3 billion of that was done in 2023. And credit markets, nature-based carbon credits are actually down a lot by more than 50%. But on the other hand, the dedicated biodiversity credit market has been growing, supposedly potentially worth more than 160 billion US dollars by 2030. But that would include both voluntary credits and also regulatory and offset credits. And there's also increasing recognition that supply chains globally are dependent on nature and on biodiversity. For example, a recent analysis has shown that 12% of agricultural output is at risk of pollinator decline. Again, that's something that we've already known for a long time, but now we have quite robust numbers that we can put against that. But there are also a lot of issues related to that. So, for example, on the biodiversity finance increase, yes, nice increase, but we still have a huge gap, more than 1 billion US dollars if we want to reach global biodiversity framework targets. In the debt for nature swap, again, a lot of issues also on the ethical side of things, but also concerns that because of economic and political volatility in those countries, it's really not a stable solution for long-term conservation. Credit markets, we've heard a bit about that already. It's really stagnating a little bit. The biodiversity credit market has a lot of potential, but there's still a lack of standardization and a lack of oversight and governance. So that's holding the market back a lot at the moment. In terms of nature dependencies and risks, there are still huge policy gaps. So more than 200 of the biggest lenders of the most at-risk sectors, including mining and agriculture, have been surveyed. And the vast majority of them have weak or non-existing policies in at least one key area of biodiversity risk. There's a lot of challenges in the state of nature finance. What are some of the key barriers in terms of biodiversity data? We all know biodiversity data are complicated. MRV can be a combination of all or any of those aspects. And so there's a real lack of clarity on what should be measured where and how. It's an economy of scale as well, so obviously investing into assessing biodiversity has to also then be cost effective and so on. And then there's also still quite a lot of confusion on the taxonomy side of things. For example, nature, biodiversity, and ecosystem services are often used almost interchangeably. So digging down a little bit more here, just with some examples. On the data sharing and availability side of things, so fair data standards are often not enforced. And the pipelines to achieve that are often not clear. So for example, under BNG, not all raw biodiversity data has to be submitted, only on certain species, for example, rare species. DNA sequencing data and raw audio recordings are often not actually stored. So we've worked a lot with nature data providers and consultancies, and they delete all their raw data after a year. So again, that's a huge amount of information here that is just lost. Then corporate sustainability reporting standards often only require really high level data. So again, there's a loss of opportunity here to get high quality biodiversity data. So of course, raw data is very expensive to store and to share, but if you think about the resources that go into collecting the data in the first place, it's a real shame that we lose that. But that does happen unless it's mandated otherwise. Then there's also real importance of communicating uncertainties and data standards better to non-experts. There was a recent poll of 420 investors, including asset owners, managers, hedge funds, and private equity groups, which was run by BNP Paribas. And they found that more than 70% thought that there's an issue with inconsistent and incomplete biodiversity data, being the biggest barriers to good ESG investing. And they found substantial discrepancy amongst data providers hindering meaningful comparison. So they found that, especially when models were being used, they got completely different results from different data providers, and so in the end they don't know really what to do with this. Part of that is down to the biodiversity data provider market being largely unregulated, but we also need to bring more expert knowledge and communication strategies to the market. Then something else that really has to be kept in mind, that people coexist with nature, we are part of nature, and we are affected by many of those aspects. So something that has maybe only quite recently received a bit more attention is the risk of privacy invasion by some of those biodiversity assessment technologies. A recent paper, for example, found that biodiversity monitoring drones were being misused by local governments and male villagers to spy on women in Indian communities. The women also were forced by camera traps recording them to change some of their behavior, so they were singing less when they collected products in the forest that they were legally allowed to collect. And then that increased their risk of being attacked by wildlife. So there are some real unintended social consequences of biodiversity monitoring going on, and that will only increase also with the use of eDNA methodologies and so on. And then, of course, a huge issue around indigenous data and knowledge ownership. I can't cover it at all in detail here, but there are a lot of opportunities, but also barriers here to be overcome. So that includes threats of cultural and intellectual property, being lost, inadequate, free, prior, and informed consent, of being obtained, loss of sovereignty, cultural appropriations, exclusion from decision-making, and so on. So there's a real risk of repeating past wrongs and also not fully realizing opportunities for local and indigenous communities. So how can we kind of tackle some of those issues? There's some really promising developments. Again, I don't have time to go into detail for any of those really, but there are a lot of nature data sharing initiatives out there. A really nice one from GBIF, they've worked with the World Bank, for example, to design a pipeline that allows companies that are funded by the World Bank to submit their ESG-related biodiversity data to GBIF. And so it is possible to do that. The World Bank mandates any of their recipients to submit their data, and unless they do that, they don't get any funds by the World Bank. There are also new reporting standards coming into force. For example, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, they've increased their scope and their coverage, and they also now require assurance and audit as part of that. There's still a lot of issues with that, a lot of details that need to be ironed out, but it's a right step in the right direction. TNFD has been mentioned before, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. They've also started some voluntary reporting standards and have quite a lot of early adopters across the world. We also have more recommendations and more guidance in a lot of this space. For example, the IAPB has just published a framework for high-integrity biodiversity credit markets. And then the Financial Reporting and Assurance Standards Institute of Canada has just published a highlight on Indigenous matters and how that can be tackled. And then at COP16, despite its many failures, there are also some positives, such as a new IPLC statutory body being established. So why are we as ecologists and biodiversity data experts needed? Many reasons, again, just a few highlighted here. So maybe the main one is that all of this is happening whether we participate or not. So there's a real danger that scientific accuracy and objective environmental impact assessments are diluted and actually resulting in counterproductive standards and compliance activities happening. Then I've worked a little bit with accountants, and something that has come up quite a lot is that accountants don't tend to think in systems, and they don't tend to think about uncertainties and aspects that are really important in biodiversity science. So they really welcome having our approach of thinking about the world in different ways and thinking about interactions and moving away from a carbon-focused world. But then there are also many opportunities that can be realized, such as access to funds and biodiversity data that has been really difficult for us as ecologists to get, especially to maintain over decades of monitoring. And then there are also some strong arguments here to really uplift nature-based solutions and biodiversity in the political agenda. And then finally, all of this, disclosures, markets, investments, and so on, of course, don't necessarily result in a positive action for biodiversity. So it's also our role here to really investigate, like some of the colleagues that have presented in the session already have done already. How can we engage? Again, just some examples here. For example, the EFRAG is currently looking to appoint secondments of biodiversity data experts to help them with their reporting standards. TNFD is asking for feedback at the moment. And then finally, there are many ways that we can work with communication experts to try and rethink how we talk and reach out to those communities. So thank you very much for that, and just also thank you to a lot of colleagues that have inspired thinking around this and work around this. So thank you for your attention.
Okay. again, not seeing any questions on the app, so if you do want to ask questions, put that in there. Otherwise, has anyone got anything? Just shout out.
I've got to talk some high-level financing or a bunch of case studies. So I was wondering how much interlinkage between those two things are. Because more regional business with projects and communities seems like it's going to be a real need for this. I just wonder, and it sounds like case studies need support for getting systems in place. I just wonder how separated or connected they are.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the scaling issue is definitely one. BNG, for example, is quite expensive. So as a small developer, you can't. It's very difficult to really engage with that. But there are some structures that are being put in place, for example, for the biodiversity finance markets, to have basically different providers coming together. Having it almost like a stock market exchange, so that you can also spread risk more easily, rather than having small individual projects engaging with those markets. So there are different solutions that are being proposed to really get that scaling done. On the supply side of things, of course, it's still the big players that are important. They are the big companies, but also banks and reinsurance companies are really looking to engage more into that. Again, small-scale providers, it's difficult, partly because we don't have the data as well. Partly because even across the supply chain, companies can't really trace back to the individual field. So yeah, definitely a lot more work that needs to be done.
Okay, well, I guess the time is up for the session, but if anyone's got any questions, I'm sure people will be around for the next few minutes. But yeah, I don't know what's happening after this. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you to our speakers. Yeah, thank you very much to our speakers.